Some men choose solitude, not because they hate people, but because peace has hurt them less than connection ever did. After years of pretending to be okay, explaining feelings nobody understood, and opening up only to feel ignored, silence slowly became safer than vulnerability. From the outside, they still look normal. They work, laugh, and socialize like everyone else. But emotionally, they keep their distance from the world around them. Because somewhere along the way, they learned that depending on people often leads to disappointment. So they stopped reaching out, stopped explaining themselves, and started carrying everything alone. And sometimes, what looks like independence is really just a man who no longer believes emotional safety exists around other people. For many men, emotional distance does not begin as confidence, it begins as survival. Somewhere early in life, they learned that certain emotions were safer kept hidden. Sadness made people uncomfortable. Fear looked weak. Vulnerability often led to embarrassment instead of understanding. So instead of expressing what they felt, they slowly learned to contain it. At first, it happened quietly. They stopped talking about what hurt them, stopped asking for comfort, stopped expecting anyone to truly understand what was happening inside their mind. And after repeating that pattern for years, emotional restraint stopped feeling forced. It started feeling natural. Some of these men became the easy one. Everyone admired. The calm friend, the quiet son, the person who never caused problems for anyone else. People called them mature, independent, emotionally strong. But beneath that image was often someone who simply learned very early that opening up changed nothing. So instead of relying on other people emotionally, they built an identity around handling everything alone. Stress became silence. Pain became isolation. Emotional exhaustion became "I'm just tired." And over time, they became so good at hiding what they felt that even the people closest to them stopped noticing when something was wrong. The dangerous part is that this kind of emotional self-containment can look healthy from the outside. A man can appear calm while silently struggling every single day. He can laugh in conversations while feeling emotionally disconnected from everyone around him. Because after spending years suppressing emotions, many men no longer know how to express vulnerability without feeling exposed. And eventually, emotional isolation stops feeling like a coping mechanism. It becomes personality. It becomes identity, a quiet belief that no matter how heavy life gets, they are supposed to carry it alone. For some men, social interaction is not physically exhausting, it is emotionally exhausting. Because after years of hiding what they truly feel, being around people can start feeling less like connection and more like performance. They carefully think about what to say, how much emotion to show, and whether they are being too distant or too emotional at the same time. Even during simple conversations, part of their mind stays guarded. They pay attention to small changes most people would ignore. A colder tone, a delayed reply, a slight shift in someone's energy. And while others move on from these moments quickly, they replay them in their head long after the conversation ends. Because somewhere deep down, they learned that emotional safety can disappear without warning. So instead of fully relaxing around people, they stay emotionally alert, constantly adjusting themselves, constantly monitoring how they are being perceived, trying not to say too much, trying not to become a burden, trying not to feel rejected before rejection even happens. And over time, this silent emotional monitoring becomes exhausting. That is why solitude can feel so peaceful to them. When they are alone, there are no expectations to manage. No pressure to appear strong, no need to hide stress behind calm expressions, or explain feelings they no longer believe anyone will truly understand. For the first time all day, their nervous system can finally relax. The sad part is that many people misunderstand this completely. They assume these men isolate because they are cold, arrogant, or antisocial. But often, the truth is much quieter than that. Some men withdraw from people because human connections stopped feeling emotionally safe a long time ago. It started feeling unpredictable, draining, and emotionally dangerous. And eventually, solitude becomes more than preference. It becomes protection, a place where they no longer have to perform strength just to feel accepted. The painful part is that many men who isolate themselves are not emotionally empty. In fact, some of them feel everything very deeply. They notice small changes in people's tone, energy, and behavior that most others would never pay attention to. But instead of expressing those feelings openly, they carry them quietly inside themselves. Because after enough disappointment, vulnerability stops feeling comforting and starts feeling dangerous. So even when they crave connection, another part of them pulls away from it at the same time. They want someone close, but struggle to trust closeness. They want to feel understood, but no longer know how to explain what they feel emotionally. And slowly, they become people who are physically present, but emotionally distant. They listen more than they speak, reveal very little about themselves, keep conversations at the surface level. Not because they have nothing inside them, but because deep down, they fear that once people truly see them, disappointment will eventually follow. Over time, loneliness starts becoming familiar, predictable, even strangely comforting. Because loneliness may hurt, but at least it feels safe. Relationships feel uncertain. Emotional exposure feels risky. And for men who spent years protecting themselves emotionally, those risks can begin to feel heavier than the loneliness itself. That is why some men disappear emotionally long before they disappear physically. And sometimes, what people call detachment is actually someone who spent so many years carrying emotions alone that they no longer know how to let anyone stand beside them emotionally. For many men, this emotional distance did not begin in adulthood. It began much earlier, often in childhood, because some boys grow up in environments where emotions are only accepted when they are easy, quiet, and convenient for other people. Sadness becomes weakness, fear becomes something embarrassing, sensitivity becomes something they are told to outgrow. So very early in life, they begin adapting. Some become the easy child, who never asks for too much, the quiet son, who avoids causing problems, the boy who learns to handle disappointment alone, because expressing pain rarely changes anything. Adults often praise children like this for being mature, independent, and strong for their age. But many times, what looked like maturity was actually emotional survival. Because when a child repeatedly feels unheard, ignored, or emotionally unsafe, he slowly stops reaching outward for comfort. Not because he no longer needs it, but because he learns not to expect it anymore. And that lesson quietly follows him into adulthood. He becomes the man who says, "I'm fine," automatically. The man who disappears emotionally when life becomes overwhelming. The man who carries stress privately because depending on people feels unfamiliar, uncomfortable, or even shameful. So instead of trusting emotional support, he learns to trust control. Control over his emotions, control over vulnerability, control over how much of himself the world is allowed to see. But the difficult truth is that a child who grows up without emotional safety often becomes an adult who struggles to believe emotional safety exists at all. Over time, this emotional self-reliance becomes more than just a coping mechanism. It becomes identity. Many men begin measuring their strength by how little they need from other people. The less vulnerable they appear, the safer they feel. The more independent they become, the more control they believe they have over their emotions. And eventually, needing nobody starts feeling like protection. But deep down, that protection comes with a quiet emotional cost. Because no matter how disconnected someone becomes, human beings are still wired for connection. Even the men who spent years isolating themselves often still crave emotional closeness. Somewhere inside them, they want to feel understood without having to explain every part of themselves. They want to feel safe enough to stop carrying everything alone, and that is where the internal conflict begins. Part of them wants intimacy. Another part remembers every moment vulnerability once led to disappointment, rejection, or emotional pain. So they live caught between two emotional needs, pulling in opposite directions. The desire to be close to someone and the fear of what closeness might eventually do to them. That is why some men seem emotionally unavailable even when they care deeply, not because they feel nothing, but because protecting themselves has become more automatic than opening up. After years of surviving through emotional distance, loneliness starts feeling more familiar than connection itself. And sometimes, the hardest thing for a man who learned to survive alone is believing that he no longer has to. Not every man who prefers to be alone is unhappy. Some people genuinely love peace, silence, and the freedom that comes with being by themselves. But there is a difference between enjoying solitude and emotionally hiding inside it. Because sometimes, the need to always be alone is not really about independence, it is about protection. Protection from disappointment, protection from emotional exhaustion, protection from the fear of being vulnerable in a world that once made vulnerability feel unsafe. And the difficult thing about living this way for too long is that eventually, isolation starts feeling normal, even when part of you still wants to be understood. Healing for men like this does not happen all at once. It does not begin with suddenly becoming outgoing or emotionally expressive overnight. It begins in smaller, quieter ways, learning that asking for support is not weakness, learning that emotions are not something to be ashamed of, learning that being emotionally seen by another person does not always end in rejection, because real strength was never about feeling nothing. Real strength was surviving experiences that forced you to carry too much alone. And maybe the goal is not to stop loving solitude. Maybe the goal is simply to build a life where being alone feels like a choice, instead of the only place your heart believes it is safe. Because deep down, most people are not searching for constant attention.